Hey there, Kevin. I was watching the debate between Doug Wilson and Renee Zoomer over Schism, and I felt compelled to make some charts diagramming the arguments that they were making. Now, I didn't include all of the arguments they made, in part because I didn't think that they would all be relevant, and also because it's taken me about 12 hours just to do this much. So, an extra however long for arguments that I didn't think were particularly relevant was something I was keen to be undertaken. Now, the debate was specifically on whether the CREC was schismatic, but it turned out to be more of a debate over what schism is. This here is really the extent of the points that were made about the CREC in particular. The most substance was around the question of why form a new denomination rather than join an existing one, which Doug responded to saying that that was what was feasible at the time, which is consistent with Doug's stance, for example, in being pro-life as opposed to being an abolitionist, taking a more incrementalist approach. And to justify himself, he appealed to America's unique situation, where Zoomer retorted that that your ecclesiology shouldn't change based on what country you're in. So that was the contention over that. Now, as I said, the main question of the debate was, what is schism? Now, Zoomer set out that schism is setting out a church authority in a place where there's already a legitimate church authority, essentially. And he qualified that if a church bound its members to heresy, it would cease to be a true authority. Now, I believe, based on the stuff he said in the debate, that if you were justly excommunicated, that would count as, that would give you the authority to start your own church too, I think. He did not lay that out particularly clearly, to my recollection. And he also said that unless one of those two things happens, no matter how bad the church gets, you're not authorized to set up a rival church, or else you'd be schismatic. And to support that position, Zoomer gives a lot of arguments. The ones you see on the left side there, Doug doesn't really respond to, because he chooses the tactic of throwing a counter rather than blocking. But there are a couple of arguments that Doug responds to directly. Particularly, he gets Zoomer to concede that the application of the temple examples are contingent on your position with covenant theology, which I'm not sure if that would apply as much to the CREC example. This is not an area I'm particularly well versed in. Now, Doug's counterpunch is that Scripture actually requires us to separate from certain people. And so if those certain people are in the church leadership, we're required to schism from them and to set up our own church, essentially. Zoomer retorts that you can separate in a negative sense without setting up a rival authority. Though, he did mention later on that he would take communion with heretics, assuming that they had the authority. So I'm not exactly sure how effective he is at creating that negative separation, at least in the current context. Now, following on from Doug's counterpoint, he says what schism is it's a working against unity. And And as discussed earlier with the CREC point, Doug is taking a more long-term approach to unity, saying there's some type of unity that we have now, but the greater unity is going to come later on. And he makes a point to say that you can't force unity. Something that Redeemed Zoomer sort of pulls out of thin air. I mean, he gives a historical precedent to it, but as far as biblical support, he pulls it out of thin air. The idea of one church per country, which Doug would counter saying the government can't force these people to be together. Not in the sense of they can't force it at gunpoint, but in that they can't force them to believe together. Which is similar to how he counters Redeemed Zoomer's point that you need top-down unity for the other unities to hold on to. He said come from the top. Saying if you just throw people together, you're not going to have unity because they don't agree. They need to agree for there to be unity. Now, most all this so far has been about the church as a whole, or to some extent it has. But there's also stuff in there about what people should do individually. There was a good bit in cross-examination about whether a person leaving the CREC would be schismatic. And I don't know if that was all handled particularly well or clearly. You can see my comments there on the slide. Now, Doug also pressed Redeemed Zoomer on when a person would be justified in leaving. Mostly from the angle of seeing if Redeemed Zoomer would accept someone who didn't meet his qualifications as having left justifiably. But the real thing I want to focus on here is the word salad, which is mostly my own doing, which was not directly in response to the hypothetical here, but it fit the flow, so that's where I put it. Where Redeemed Zoomer said, we'll take for example someone who's in the PCA saying that it would not be schismatic for him to leave the PCA, which Redeemed Zoomer classifies as a schismatic denomination. It would not be schismatic for him to leave the PCA to join the PCUSA, which he says is not schismatic, so long as he was doing it with an attitude of unity, essentially wasn't stirring up a bunch of trouble. Now, this seems to be a bit contradictory. If you recall his position, you're not allowed to set up a rival authority, no matter how bad the church gets, so long as you're not bound to heresy. Well, it seems to me that no matter how bad you say the schism is, it's not binding you to heresy, so you wouldn't be justified in leaving the PCA. Now, what you could say is you could say that PCA is not a true church, which would be a pretty wild claim on the face of it. You could possibly say that since you're not setting up a rival authority, you're not really schisming. But then there would be no issue with joining the PCA either, because it already exists. You're not setting up a rival authority.